My daughter-in-law laughed at me when I brought a bag of old clothes to donate. She looked at me in front of everyone and said, "Who would want this trash?" I stayed quiet, but inside my heart was breaking. A week later, she walked into a charity auction and saw those very same clothes being sold for millions. The name on the tag revealed a secret about my past that left her stunned. Stay with me, because you need to hear how it all happened. And before we go further, make sure to subscribe to my channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. My name is Margaret, and I am 72 years old. I live with my son Thomas, his wife Vanessa, and their little boy Ethan. My husband passed away many years ago, and since then I've tried to keep myself busy with small things that give me peace. I spend my mornings in the garden, my afternoons in the kitchen, and on weekends I like to pack bags of clothes and items to give to charity. It makes me feel useful, like I am still contributing something good to the world. Thomas is a kind man, but he is quiet. He works long hours and avoids conflict whenever he can. Vanessa, on the other hand, is loud, confident, and often dismissive of me. She cares a lot about appearances, about what people think of her, and about money. I have tried many times to be patient with her, but she often looks at me as if I am nothing more than a burden. The only person who truly lights up my days is my grandson Ethan. He is 12 years old, full of energy, and he never fails to remind me that love still exists in this house. He listens to my stories, he laughs at my jokes, and when he hugs me, I feel like I still have a purpose. But deep inside me, there is something no one in this house knows. Long before I became a wife and a mother, I had another life. A life filled with hard work, talent, and recognition. I left it all behind to raise my family, and I never once complained. I thought I had buried that part of myself forever, until one day, when a simple bag of clothes opened a door to the past and changed everything. The day everything began to change started as an ordinary afternoon. I had been cleaning out my closet, folding clothes I no longer wore, and packing them neatly into a large donation bag. Some of the garments were simple sweaters, a few were dresses I hadn't worn in decades, and tucked among them were pieces from a part of my past I rarely thought about. I had kept them all these years, not because of their value, but because they carried memories. To me, donating them was a way of letting those memories live on through someone else. When I carried the bag into the living room, Vanessa was sitting on the couch scrolling through her phone. She looked up, raised an eyebrow, and gave a small laugh. "What's that supposed to be?" she asked, pointing at the bag. "I'm taking these clothes to donate," I said gently. "The charity down the street is holding their yearly drive, and I thought they could use them." She burst out laughing, shaking her head. "You've got to be kidding me. Who would want that trash? Look at these old patterns, these faded colors. Even the thrift store would throw them out." Her words stung, but I tried to stay calm. "Vanessa, there are people who need clothes more than we do. To them, even something old can be useful." She smirked and looked back at her phone. "Useful? No, Margaret. Embarrassing. That's what it is. You're lucky Thomas lets you live here. Instead of hauling junk around, maybe you should think about how you look to other people. This makes us look cheap." At that moment, I noticed Thomas had walked into the room. He froze in place, hearing every word, but he didn't step forward. He lowered his eyes and slipped quietly into the kitchen. That silence hurt even more than Vanessa's insults. I had raised him to stand for what was right, but now he couldn't even speak for me. I felt my cheeks warm with humiliation. A few of Vanessa's friends, who had stopped by for coffee, were sitting nearby. One of them giggled and whispered something under her breath. They all looked at me as if I were foolish, an old woman clinging to useless junk. I wanted the floor to open beneath me so I could disappear. Still, I refused to let the tears fall. Instead, I picked up the bag and said softly, "I will donate them anyway. They will help someone." And with that, I walked out the door. As I walked down the street to the donation center, my mind swirled with emotions. I thought about how little Vanessa understood about kindness, about giving without expecting something back. I thought about the sacrifices I had made for this family, how I had given up so much of myself to create a home for them. And I thought about the pieces inside that bag, beautiful dresses and blouses I had designed long ago, under my maiden name, Margaret Sinclair. Back in those days before I married Richard, I worked for a respected fashion house. My designs had been worn by women who admired elegance and grace. Some pieces had even been photographed in magazines. But when I chose marriage and motherhood, I left that world behind without regret. Family mattered more to me than fame. Over the years, I rarely spoke of it. To Vanessa, I was just an old woman with wrinkled hands and outdated habits. She never knew the life I had lived before. That night, at dinner, Vanessa couldn't resist bringing it up again. "Thomas," she said with a laugh, "your mother was walking down the street carrying a bag of rags today. She's so determined to give away junk, it's almost funny." Thomas shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Ethan, sweet boy that he is, looked up at me with wide eyes. "Grandma, why do you give away your clothes?" he asked. I smiled at him and answered softly, "Because sometimes what we no longer need can mean everything to someone else." Vanessa rolled her eyes. "Or maybe it just makes us look pathetic," she muttered. I didn't reply. There was no point arguing with someone who only measured worth in money and appearances. But deep inside, I felt something stirring. She thought my clothes were worthless. She thought I was worthless. But she had no idea of the truth those clothes carried. For the rest of the week, I noticed the way she smirked whenever she saw me. She whispered on the phone to her friends, telling them about my donation bag and how ridiculous it was. Every time I heard her laugh, my heart ached a little more. Yet I stayed quiet because I knew life has its way of revealing truth when the time is right, and that truth was about to come sooner than Vanessa ever expected. The charity was hosting a fundraising auction in just a few days. Among the items they planned to showcase were a few of the very pieces she had mocked. Pieces that once belonged to a forgotten part of my life, a part of me that was about to return in a way no one saw coming. The days after Vanessa mocked me for donating the clothes felt heavier than usual. The house seemed quieter, but not in a peaceful way. It was the kind of silence filled with unspoken words and hidden tension. Vanessa carried herself with a little more smugness, as though humiliating me had earned her a victory. She bragged to her friends on the phone, saying things like, "You wouldn't believe what Margaret tried to give away." Honestly, I should have just thrown it in the trash myself. Each time I overheard her, the sting returned, but I bit my tongue. I could have argued, could have shouted back, but I chose not to. I had lived long enough to know that the truth has a way of rising to the surface when the time is right. Still, in those quiet moments in my room, I prayed Richard was watching over me, reminding me to stay strong. A few days later, I received a small flyer in the mail from the local charity. It announced their annual fundraising auction. My heart skipped when I read the details, featuring rare vintage clothing pieces generously donated this year. I knew instantly that some of my items would be included. I had donated several garments from my early career, original designs that carried my maiden name, Margaret Sinclair, stitched carefully inside the tags. At the time, I hadn't thought twice about it, but now I realized what it might mean. My hands trembled slightly as I held the flyer. Could it be possible that after all these years, my work would be recognized again? Fashion collectors were known to pay large sums for authentic vintage pieces, especially those tied to designers who had become scarce or forgotten. I had left that world decades ago, but maybe my work hadn't left me. That night at dinner, I mentioned the auction casually. "The charity is holding a fundraiser this week. They'll be showcasing some of the donations." Vanessa smirked and leaned back in her chair. "Oh, you mean your bag of rags? I doubt anyone will even bother looking at those." She laughed, shaking her head. "Honestly, it will be embarrassing for them to even put those up." Thomas shifted uncomfortably, but again, he said nothing. Ethan, however, looked curious. "Can we go, Grandma? I want to see the auction." I smiled at him. "Yes, Ethan. We can go," Vanessa snorted. "What's the point? Those events are just excuses for rich people to waste money. Besides, no one there is going to care about anything you donated." But her arrogance didn't faze me this time. Something inside me felt different. I decided I would attend the auction, not to prove her wrong, but to remind myself that the part of me I had left behind was still alive. Whether or not anyone recognized the clothes, I wanted to witness what became of them. The night before the auction, I sat alone in my room, holding one of Richard's photographs. "You always told me my work mattered," I whispered. "Tomorrow, we'll see if anyone else still thinks so." I felt a calm strength fill me, the kind I hadn't felt in years. The next morning, Vanessa announced she wanted to attend the auction too. "It's a charity event," she said with false sweetness. "Good place to network, maybe meet people who matter." She slipped on her expensive red dress and high heels, looking like she was preparing for a gala. Thomas, as usual, went along silently. Ethan begged to ride with me, and I was glad for the company of someone who truly believed in me. When we arrived, the atmosphere was buzzing. The hall was filled with elegantly dressed men and women, all eager to bid on unique items for a good cause. Tables displayed jewelry, artwork, and clothing. I walked slowly, my heart pounding, as I wondered if any of my pieces would catch someone's attention. Vanessa looked unimpressed at first. "Overpriced junk," she whispered to Thomas. "People just like to show off how much money they can waste." But her tone carried no real conviction. She was here for the prestige, not the cause. As I scanned the room, I saw a familiar silhouette on one of the mannequins near the stage. A dress I had sewn by hand over 50 years ago. My breath caught in my throat. It was simple yet elegant, with delicate stitching that only I could have made. The label inside would be unmistakable, Margaret Sinclair. I didn't say a word to Vanessa. I simply waited, my hands folded in front of me, my heart steady. The moment was coming, and I knew it would change everything. The announcer tapped the microphone and called for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored tonight to present a very special collection, donated anonymously. These pieces are authentic works of the celebrated designer Margaret Sinclair, whose rare designs are now considered iconic in the fashion world." Gasps rippled through the crowd. People leaned forward in their seats. Collectors murmured to each other with excitement. I glanced at Vanessa. She blinked rapidly, her confident smirk fading as confusion spread across her face. And in that moment, I felt a shift deep inside me. The ridicule I had endured, the silence I had suffered, all of it was about to be replaced by the truth. The auction hall grew quiet as the announcer's words echoed through the room. "Authentic works of Margaret Sinclair, the celebrated designer whose rare vintage pieces are among the most sought after in today's market." I felt my breath catch. It had been decades since anyone had spoken my name in that way, and now it rang out in front of a crowd filled with strangers, and my own family, who had no idea. A tall man in a tailored suit wheeled out a mannequin draped in one of my oldest designs, a cream-colored evening dress with hand-stitched embroidery along the hem. Gasps rose from the crowd. The announcer explained how the piece had been verified and authenticated, noting the original label still intact. "This dress is estimated to start at $100,000, he said. My heart pounded in my chest. I remembered the long nights I had spent sewing that dress, the careful way I matched each thread, the pride I felt when the magazine first published it. To me, it had been a chapter of my youth. To them, it was a priceless treasure. The bidding began almost instantly. Hands shot up across the room. $150,000, someone called. $200,000, another voice countered. The numbers climbed higher and higher, and my head swam with disbelief. By the time the gavel came down, the dress had sold for over $500,000. I turned slightly to glance at Vanessa. Her mouth hung open, her face pale, her fingers frozen on her wine glass. She whispered to Thomas, Is that her name? Margaret Sinclair? Thomas looked stunned, his brow furrowed as he tried to process what he was hearing. For once, he had no words. But the announcer wasn't finished. One by one, more pieces were revealed. A tailored blazer, a silk blouse, a cocktail dress, all designs I had once poured my heart into, each bearing the same small stitched label with my name. With each unveiling, the room buzzed louder. Collectors whispered excitedly, Journalists scribbled notes, and bidders competed fiercely. 600,000, 800,000, over 1 million. The gavel struck again and again. Every sale left the room in awe, and with each strike, I felt a piece of my dignity being restored. Ethan tugged gently at my sleeve, his eyes wide with wonder. "Grandma, that's you! You made those? You're famous!" His voice was filled with pride, and I felt tears sting my eyes. I squeezed his hand and whispered, "Yes, sweetheart, I did." Meanwhile, Vanessa sat frozen, her earlier arrogance stripped away completely. The very clothes she had mocked, the ones she had called trash, were now treasures worth millions. Her cheeks burned red as people around her murmured in excitement. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, unable to escape the truth unraveling in front of her. At one point, the announcer held up a gown with flowing fabric and intricate beadwork, one of my most cherished designs. "This piece," he said, "is a once-in-a-lifetime find. Only a handful of Margaret Sinclair originals remain in the world. We are privileged to offer it here, tonight." The bidding war was fierce. Voices overlapped, numbers climbed rapidly. By the time the gavel came down, the gown had sold for nearly $2 million. The audience erupted in applause. Cameras flashed as reporters hurried to capture the moment. I sat quietly, my hands folded in my lap, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening. For so long, I had been treated as if my best years were behind me, as if my worth had faded with time. But now, in this room full of strangers, my work was alive again, celebrated, cherished, and valued beyond measure. Vanessa leaned toward Thomas, her voice trembling. "Why didn't she ever tell us? Why didn't you know?" Thomas shook his head slowly, his eyes fixed on me with a mix of shock and admiration. For the first time in years, he looked at me not as his aging mother, but as someone extraordinary. When the auction ended, the organizers thanked the donors and praised the generosity behind the items. Several people approached me, asking quietly if I was the Margaret Sinclair. I smiled humbly, nodding, though I didn't seek their attention. I hadn't donated those clothes for fame or fortune. I had given them because I believed in helping others. The money raised would go to children in need, to families without homes, to people who had nothing. That, more than the millions, filled me with pride. As we left the hall, Ethan clung to my hand, chattering excitedly. "Grandma, you're amazing. I'm going to tell all my friends about you." His joy was pure and unshakable, and in that moment I knew everything I had sacrificed for family had been worth it. Vanessa walked behind us in silence, her head lowered, the weight of her shame pressing down on her. She had spent years mocking me, dismissing me, and treating me as if I had no value. But the truth had silenced her in a way I never could, and as I stepped out into the cool night air, I felt lighter than I had in decades. My past had finally spoken for me. The clothes she laughed at had revealed the truth. I was not worthless. I was never trash. I was a woman who had built a legacy, even if no one in my family had known. The night of the auction stayed with me long after we returned home. As I stepped back into the house, I looked around with new eyes. This was the same living room where I had been mocked, where my daughter-in-law had called my clothes trash, and where my son had stayed silent. Yet now, those same clothes had changed everything. They had not only raised millions for charity, but also revealed the truth about who I was and what I had once built. For years, I had kept my past hidden, not because I was ashamed, but because I chose family over recognition. I had poured myself into raising Thomas, into making a home, into being the steady presence that kept life moving forward. But in silence, my story had been forgotten. The auction reminded not only the world, but also my own family, that I was more than what they saw in front of them. That evening, Thomas came to me quietly. His face looked heavy with guilt, his voice softer than I had heard in years. "Mom," he said, "I never knew. I never knew you were Margaret Sinclair. I never knew you created something so important." His eyes filled with tears. "And I'm sorry. I should have defended you when she treated you that way. I failed you." I placed my hand on his and smiled gently. Thomas, I didn't need you to know my past. I only needed you to remember my worth in the present. We all forget sometimes that people have stories we don't see. You know now, and that's what matters. He nodded, gripping my hand tightly, as though he were holding on to more than just skin and bone, as though he were holding on to the chance to finally honor me properly. Ethan came running into the room then, his face glowing with pride. Grandma, I told my friends at school today that you're a famous designer. They couldn't believe it. They said you're a legend. His excitement was contagious, and I laughed for the first time in a long while, pulling him into my arms. His words meant more to me than the millions earned. To him, I wasn't just someone who cooked his meals or told bedtime stories. I was someone to admire, someone to look up to. That was the real treasure. As for Vanessa, she stayed quiet for days after the auction. Gone were the smirks, the dismissive remarks, the loud judgments. I would catch her glancing at me sometimes, her expression caught between embarrassment and regret. She never said the words "I'm sorry," but her silence was an admission. She had been forced to confront a truth she couldn't ignore. The woman she had mocked, the woman she thought of as useless, had built something she could never dream of achieving. One morning, she finally approached me in the kitchen. Her voice was low, almost hesitant. "Margaret, I didn't realize." I spoke out of turn. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. I simply nodded and replied, "Respect should never depend on someone's past accomplishments. It should exist because we share this home, because we share this family." She looked away, unable to meet my eyes, but I knew she had heard me. Over the next weeks, life in the house felt different. The tension had not disappeared completely, but there was a shift. Thomas treated me with more warmth, asking about my designs, about the years I had once kept to myself. Ethan proudly showed his friends the auction articles, clipping them out of newspapers and tucking them into his pocket, them into a scrapbook labeled Grandma's Legacy. Even Vanessa, though still proud, seemed careful with her words. The sting in her tone was gone. I often sat in my garden in the afternoons, sipping tea, reflecting on everything. I thought about how quickly people dismiss what they don't understand. I thought about how easily we measure worth in money, appearances, or status, forgetting that true value is built from years of work, sacrifice, and love. And I realized something. The lesson was never just about my clothes. It was about people. We are too quick to throw others away, to label them as old or useless, when in reality they carry stories, talents, and wisdom that could change everything if only we chose to see it. The clothes raised millions, yes, but the real victory was in the respect that returned to my home. My past had been hidden, but it rose when the time was right, not to make me wealthy or famous again, but to remind my family and anyone who hears this story that nothing and no one should be dismissed without care. To this day, Ethan still asks me to tell him stories of when I was Margaret Sinclair. He listens wide-eyed, as though he is watching history unfold in front of him. And every time I tell him, I remind him of this. People's value does not fade with age. It grows if only we choose to look. So when you hear my story, I want you to remember, the people you overlook, the ones you underestimate, may hold treasures you cannot even imagine. Respect them while they are still here. And if you stayed with me through the end of this story, I want to thank you. Please subscribe to my channel and leave a comment telling me where you are watching from. I'd love to hear your thoughts and stories too.